So welcome to Grumpy Old Men Getting It Off Their Chests. It'll be fun, yes, as Monko says. This session is generously sponsored by the Australian Writers Guild and is chaired by Jacqueline Woodham, who is part of the sponsor. So please make welcome. Oh, we have a change here. Mungo has kindly stepped in for Bob Ellis. So please... So please welcome Peter Singer, David Williamson and Mungo McCullum.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. Our pen-empty chair this session is taken by Baraki Jebra Selassie, a former member of Eritrea's government who joined 14 other senior officials in signing an open letter that criticised the administration. Imagine if that was what was going to happen here today. He, however, has remained detained without charge or trial since 2001. I urge you, if these empty chairs have moved you, support PEN Australia. Our sponsor today is the Australian Writers Guild. David Williamson is the Emeritus President of the Australian Writers Guild, and I'm its Director. We're delighted to be sponsoring the festival because we believe that ideas matter, that talent should be celebrated and creativity encouraged. As the national organisation representing performance writers, that's writers for film, television, theatre, radio and new media, we are particularly pleased to be supporting this session because we love a bit of drama. If you fancy yourself as a performance writer or would just like to find out more about us, pick up one of our magazines, which are down the front here on the stage after the session, or in the info tent afterwards, if there's any left. This session, we're going to get stuck into everything from gripes and pet hates, but mostly lifelong passions, convictions, and chronic indignations. Our panel members are well known to you. They're outspoken social and political and philosophical observers and commentators. They've never been afraid to speak their mind, with decades of addressing their audiences in controversial and thought-provoking ways. And of course, they all have grey hair.
Only some.
And they are prolific. My God, they are prolific. When I chose this panel, I had no idea what I was in for. What an idiot. To choose people with 40 years and 40 plays and 12 screenplays and reams and reams and reams of published work, all of it worth spending months reading and analysing. They've all been asking their audiences to look at our lives and our society through very different mediums, but over the same decades and through the same political and cultural climates. They've stimulated discussion, they've aroused debate, they've established an enormous support base and a not insignificant band of haters to boot. They have critics who receive a great deal of column inches and airtime, and they haven't taken it lying down. So, while influential, powerful, opinionated and considered with impressive and imposing intellects, they speak to us in ways we can relate to and that we identify with. They're fairly unique in this regard. Whether by using characters in human drama, humorous and astute observations, or hypotheticals and compelling logic. Last year, when I introduced the panel that I was hosting, I had to admit to being ever so slightly in love with one or two of them. Miriam Margolyes, it was impossible not to fall in love with her. This year, well, frankly, I'm just intimidated. Their reputations precede them, and they are Mungo McCullum, Peter Singer, and David Williamson. I'm not going to read out a list of their works. If you're not familiar with their work, read the program and take some time out. Now, Bob Ellis was slated in the program to be on the session, but he was unknowingly double booked and was required elsewhere in the festival. And let's face it, he's probably just not quite grumpy enough. Now, while we're on corrections in the program, I have to make one correction through fear that I may lose my job. In the program, I'm listed as being a prolific comedic writer. I want to state categorically that I am not a writer, I am not prolific, and I am not comedic. I may be mildly amusing on occasion, but I'm certainly not comedic. And this is important because, as the director of the Australian Writers Guild, several of the board members who pay my salary are in fact prolific comedic writers. And if they ever saw this program, they'd have my guts for garters. It was a typo. In fact, it was the abbreviated first half of the sentence from last year's program. In last year's program, I was interviewing comedians, and so I wrote at the end of my bio, Jacqueline is also a prolific comedic writer, having once penned a pithy little chapter entitled The Role of Economic Policy in Post-Conflict Reconstruction - The Case of East Timor. A self-evidently humourless academic piece that no one ever read, least of all in East Timor. So you'll see that the omission of the second half of that sentence gives an altogether different take on my abilities. So for the record, in case my boss has ever seen my bio in this program, I'm not a writer, and I can confirm that I've learnt my lesson about sarcasm in bios. And so to business. Gentlemen, we'll start off easy. Let's start with the traditional fodder of grumpy old men on television. Do you have any pet hates, any gnawing, recurring irritations? Mungo, let's start with you.
Yes, I do. I have a pet hate at overlong introductions. But I'm going to go past the obvious ones. I mean, things like cling wrap and robotic phone answers and airline food and the Brisbane Broncos. I mean, these are all obvious and everybody hates them. But there is one thing that at the moment I'm particularly on about, and that is the apparent retreat from rationality in our society. And by that I'm not just talking about the Byron Bay fads, things like astrology and numerology and tarot cards and palmistry and Scientology and Christianity and all the other nonsense. I'm talking about a much more general thing that goes through the community and is much more harmful. Now, irrationality in the ways that I've already mentioned, if taken in moderation, may be tiresome, but it doesn't do a great deal of harm. But when it permeates a society, when it becomes the absolute reason for being of that society, it can be very dangerous indeed. And the most obvious, I suppose, and the most widely publicised example is the teaching of creationism in schools as a substitute for evolution. I mean, evolution is science. Evolution is the scientific method. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming, and everybody who is even remotely qualified in the area has accepted it. We may not be sure of all the details. We may not be able to fill in every gap, but we do know that the principle works, and it has been seen to work for 100 years. And this applies, this credulity for nonsense has now permeated Western society to the extent that we're told nearly 50% of Americans put intelligent design as equally probable to evolution. Now, this is so stupid and so disturbing that it says something about our society I would rather not even think about. And the way that the society moves as a result of it, you have much more immediately relevant and much more threatening science treated in the same way. And I'm talking, of course, about climate change.